The title of this talk is Thomism and Phenomenology, Divergent Ways of Seeing. And there is a question mark at the end there, and the question mark is important because both the scope and the possibility of dialogue between these two philosophical traditions remain an open question for me. And I want to make sure that that's clear from the very beginning. If my manner of speaking or my mode of argumentation, there's a handout that will be extremely helpful, so just does everyone have one? Okay, great. So if my manner of speaking or my mode of argumentation makes it seem otherwise, then I want you to blame that on me being a brash, brazen, overconfident American, and not on me thinking that I've somehow got all of the answers. So if it isn't rock-solid answers that I'm offering you today, what do I have to offer? Well, I'd like you to think of this talk as an exercise, not just in criticism, but in metacriticism. So the goal is twofold. First, I want to subject an attitude towards dialogue that I find especially prevalent among contemporary Catholic intellectuals to sustained criticism. Then, second, I'd like to subject that criticism itself to further criticism. So that's the meta-criticism. And the precise attitude that I want to consider with you guys tonight and to critique is something that I'd like to call dialogical naivete. And that can be defined on your handout. So dialogical naivete is an attitude of presuming that dialogue between Thomists and phenomenologists, or Thomism and phenomenology, as such, is largely unproblematic. So it's important to note that dialogical naivete, as I'm defining it, is an attitude of presuming, not a principled opinion. So if someone has rigorously reflected on the nature of phenomenology, the nature of Thomism, and the possibility of dialogue between the two, and then formed a considered judgment that dialogue between Thomists and phenomenologists, as such, is indeed largely unproblematic, then that person would not, by my lights, count as a dialogical naivetist. Rather, such a person should be called a dialogical optimist. And there's nothing wrong, per se, with dialogical optimism, other than the high likelihood of it being false. Dialogical naivete, however, is quite a bit more dangerous, in part because I think it's quite a bit more prevalent. Relatively few people, even among professional philosophers, have engaged in the sort of rigorous reflection required for either dialogical optimism or its counterpart, dialogical pessimism. But a truly enormous number of people, and especially Catholic philosophers and theologians, have been influenced by the life, work, and example of people like Pope St. John Paul II and Edith Stein, also known as St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. And they've been influenced by them in such a way as to be predisposed towards assuming that dialogue between, or perhaps even a fusion of, these two philosophical traditions is indeed possible, and maybe even desirable. After all, Pope John Paul II and Edith Stein are widely regarded as in some way belonging to both traditions. And if they could bring the two together in themselves, then it sure seems, at least prima facie, that it must be possible to bring the two into dialogue. And, at least in my experience, that's where the vast majority of Catholic intellectuals just let the matter lie, with the presumption that dialogue between Thomism and phenomenology, as such, is largely unproblematic. In other words, with dialogical naivete. Nevertheless, there are some Thomists who oppose dialogical naivete, not simply because it's naive, but also because it's dialogical. In other words, there are some Thomists who are dialogical pessimists, holding the considered opinion that dialogue between Thomists and phenomenologists as such is problematic. The first goal of my talk, then, is to present the philosophical reasons motivating that dialogical pessimism. And I say philosophical reasons because there are plenty of non-philosophical reasons that might motivate pessimism about the possibility of dialogue between Thomists and phenomenologists. So personal immaturity could motivate it, the bad example of others could motivate it, the traumatic memories of a Thomist who was teased as a child by rowdy gangs of phenomenologists, and so on. I'm not interested in those sorts of reasons or motivations. Instead, I want to focus on the principled philosophical reasons that a Thomist might have for skepticism or pessimism about the fruitfulness of dialogue between these two philosophical traditions. As such, this talk is going to be partly sociological and partly speculative. It'll be sociological insofar as it catalogs and presents the actual arguments that I have heard Thomists make against such dialogue in the wild, so to speak. It'll be speculative insofar as it also presents arguments inspired by existing criticisms, but which are, at least to the best of my knowledge, genuinely new. Those are the arguments that I've concocted in the lab. So the plan for the talk is simple. In section 1, I'll present a family of arguments for dialogical pessimism that I will call impossibility arguments. In section 2, I'll present a different family of arguments for the same conclusion, which I will call impracticality arguments. And then finally, in section 3, I'll engage in a bit of metacriticism, weighing in on which, if any, of the arguments against dialogical naivete succeed in raising real problems for the prospect of dialogue between Thomism and phenomenology. So, section 1, impossibility arguments. I'd like to begin by considering what I take to be the more radical of the two sets of reasons for pessimism about dialogue between Thomism and phenomenology. And I call these arguments impossibility arguments because they take the following form, and you have this on your handout. Premise 1, Thomists shouldn't try to do the impossible. Premise 2, dialogue with phenomenologists as such is impossible. Ergo, Thomists shouldn't try to dialogue with phenomenologists as such. Now, I doubt that anyone on either side will object to premise 1. But why endorse premise 2? Well, the first thing to note about that premise is the as such qualifier. Premise 2 is not claiming that dialogue with phenomenologists is impossible. After all, Professors Macaulay and Janssen of the Husserl Archives, who could even be here, you're not here, are you? No. Okay, great. They're both here at KU Leuven, both are phenomenologists, and I, a Thomist, could easily enter into dialogue with either one of them. Ergo, dialogue between phenomenologists and Thomists is not impossible. That's not what premise 2 is about. Rather, what the second premise is denying is the possibility of my dialoguing with them precisely as phenomenologists. For while it is true that they are phenomenologists, and it is true that I can dialogue with them, it does not follow that I can dialogue with them insofar as they are phenomenologists. Perhaps my dialogue with them is possible because deep down they're really Thomists. Or perhaps I'm able to dialogue with them because all of us are at least implicitly committed to a sort of lowest common denominator philosophia perennis. The precise account isn't important. What is important is that premise 2 denies the existence of common ground between Thomism and phenomenology precisely as such. But even with that qualification in mind, why should we think that premise 2 is true? In my experience, Thomists can and do give varied answers to that question. But all the answers that I've heard fall into one of two categories, and those constitute two subclasses of impossibility arguments. We can call them no such thing arguments and incommensurability arguments. The general forms of both are also on the handout. So they go like this. General form of a no such thing argument. If there's no such thing as phenomenology, then dialogue with phenomenologists as such is impossible. But guess what? There's no such thing as phenomenology. Ergo, dialogue with phenomenologists as such is impossible. Compare that to the general form of an incommensurability argument. That goes like this. If phenomenology is incommensurable with Thomism, then dialogue with phenomenologists as such is impossible. But phenomenology is incommensurable with Thomism. Ergo, dialogue with phenomenologists as such is impossible. It's worth noting that these subclasses of impossibility argument are mutually exclusive. If there's no such thing as phenomenology, then phenomenology and Thomism cannot be incommensurable. Likewise, if phenomenology and Thomism are incommensurable, then there must be such a thing as phenomenology. Thus, even though both sorts of arguments have been offered by Thomists in the past, no single Thomist can endorse both sets of arguments, at least on pain of contradiction. So let's begin with the no such thing argument. Like the general form of the impossibility argument, the no such thing argument has an unobjectionable first premise and a very objectionable second premise. The question then is why anyone would want to deny the existence of phenomenology. After all, that sounds crazy. But I've got at least 4 not crazy arguments that I've been given in support of that crazy sounding thesis. Each one trades on a different account of the unity of a philosophical school or movement or tradition, namely by appealing to shared doctrines or shared methods or shared authorities or shared topics. And being an unapologetic Thomist, I like to think of these as material, formal, efficient, and final causal sources of unity, respectively. So let me walk you through each one. The argument from material or doctrinal unity goes like this. If there were such a thing as phenomenology, it would have some distinctive doctrinal unity. But it doesn't, so there isn't. That phenomenology lacks even minimal doctrinal unity should be clear. After all, some phenomenologists are realists, others are idealists. Some phenomenologists are Marxists, others are capitalists. Some phenomenologists are moral objectivists, others are moral relativists. Pick any topic you want, and you can find phenomenologists who disagree about that topic. Moreover, even if you could find a topic on which literally every single phenomenologist happens to agree, that agreement wouldn't be necessary. The presupposition, of course, is that doctrinal unity is what constitutes a philosophical movement or school or tradition. While not unobjectionable, I do think that's a reasonable assumption. After all, Thomists may debate the merits or demerits of the 24 Thomistic theses, but we don't debate whether Thomism comes with at least some doctrinal commitments. Atheist Thomists, or non-hylomorphic Thomists, or moral relativist Thomists are not Thomists. Okay. Here's a second reason for thinking that there's no such thing as phenomenology. Because it lacks methodological unity. Prima facie, that might sound strange. After all, isn't the phenomenological method the very thing that phenomenology is most known for? Surely it is. But as soon as we ask what precisely this phenomenological method is, things start to get dicey. Does the phenomenological method require us to bracket questions of existence or not? Does it require agnosticism about truth or veracity or not? Does it require a commitment to idealism or not? Moreover, as Mark Spencer, an American phenomenologist and Thomist, has recently and rightly pointed out, there are marked differences between, say, Husserl's phenomenological reduction and Jean-Luc Marion's phenomenological reduction, and differences between both of those and various realist phenomenological reductions. What, if anything, do they all have in common that would distinguish them from non-phenomenological philosophical schools or movements? Perhaps for that very reason, another American phenomenologist, Walter Hoppe, has argued that, and here I'm quoting him, it's important not to place too much emphasis on the phenomenological reduction as the touchstone regarding what is and is not phenomenological in character, close quote. In light of those caveats, Thomists frequently voice the worry that phenomenology amounts to little, if anything, more than an exhortation to just pay careful attention to the way that things appear to us. And while such an exhortation is laudable, it's not one that requires us to look or to move beyond the bounds of Thomism in order to hear. Our own tradition already contains all the resources required to enjoy the fruits of that exhortation. The argument from formal or methodological unity then goes like this. If there were such a thing as phenomenology, it would have some distinctive methodological unity. But it doesn't, so there isn't. A third version of the no such thing argument comes from the view that philosophical schools are constituted by authoritative unity. The idea here is that philosophical texts and philosophical figures can and do become authoritative for subsequent philosophical communities. That doesn't mean that everyone in those communities blindly follows the authority. Rather, what it means is that those authors and texts directly or indirectly frame the questions that are raised, the debates that are had, and the answers that are given in the tradition that follows them. One would be a Thomist, for example, to the extent that his or her approach to and thinking about ontology or ethics or epistemology or politics is directly or indirectly framed by the thought of Thomas Aquinas. By this measure, however, phenomenology might not be a philosophy or a school or a movement or a tradition at all. For, at least so the argument goes, there simply are no authorities that are common to all phenomenologists. Franz Brentano, for example, is regularly referred to as a practitioner of phenomenology, but he predates Husserl and Husserl's school. Likewise, and I think even more powerfully, recent literature in comparative philosophy has drawn attention to what's become known as Buddhist phenomenology, which is entirely unconnected, at least from an efficient causal point of view, from European phenomenology. If that's right, then it gives us a third rationale for the no such thing argument. If there were such a thing as phenomenology, it would have some distinctive authoritative unity. But it doesn't, so there isn't. The fourth and final rationale I've heard Thomists give for insisting that there's no such thing as phenomenology is an argument from teleological or topical unity. That argument goes like this. If there were such a thing as phenomenology, it would have some distinctive topical unity. But it doesn't, so there isn't. Here, the idea is that branches of philosophy are individuated or distinguished by the topics that they study, knowledge of which is their end or goal or telos for that branch of philosophy. That's why I characterize it as a final causal approach. The philosophy of physics is distinct from the philosophy of biology precisely because it aims at or is ordered towards knowledge of different things. They're about different topics. When considered in this way, phenomenology is usually described as studying the structures of consciousness or experience. But it isn't obvious that this constitutes a distinctive topic, for that could plausibly be reduced either entirely to the philosophy of mind or to some combination of philosophy of mind and philosophical anthropology. And if that's the case, then it would seem like there isn't really any such thing as phenomenology. There's just philosophy of mind and or philosophical anthropology. So thus far, I've been reporting on arguments that I've heard Thomists give in the wild. But I think these arguments can be systematized and combined into a sort of no such thing master argument. And I've given you that on the handout. It goes like this. If there were such a thing as phenomenology, it would have some distinctive either material or formal or efficient or final causal unity. But phenomenology has no distinctive material or formal or efficient or final causal unity. Ergo, there's no such thing as phenomenology. And if there's no such thing as phenomenology, then dialogue with phenomenologists as such is impossible. Ergo, dialogue with phenomenologists as such is impossible. And since Thomists shouldn't try to do the impossible, Thomists shouldn't try to dialogue with phenomenologists as such. For now, I want to remind you that no such thing arguments are not the only kind of impossibility argument on offer. Earlier, I mentioned something called an incommensurability argument, where no such thing arguments view phenomenology as so insubstantial that there's nothing to dialogue with. We can think of incommensurability arguments as viewing phenomenology as so substantial, so solid and self-contained, that there's no way for the Thomist to break in. There's no entry point for dialogue to start. Despite that important and obvious difference, the forms taken by the incommensurability argument parallel the different forms of the no such thing argument, at least in my experience. For I've heard fellow Thomists suggest that dialogue between Thomism and phenomenology is impossible on the grounds of doctrinal incommensurability, methodological incommensurability, authoritative incommensurability, and topical incommensurability. With respect to doctrine, by far the most common objection on the Thomist side is that phenomenology is explicitly committed to or implicitly entails agnosticism about what is real at best, or at worst, straight up idealism. And given the centrality of Thomism's commitment to realism, the absence of common ground on that point sure would seem to entail or imply an absence of common ground on basically all other points. With respect to method, the most common objection is that phenomenology works eidetically, is the language, whereas scholasticism works dianoetically. Or, to use Thomist language rather than phenomenology language, phenomenology engages only in the first and second operations of the intellect, so what we call simple apprehension and judgment, whereas scholasticism engages in all three and puts the emphasis on the third operation of the intellect, which is reasoning. A more refined version of that objection would go like this. Thomistic philosophical methodology requires the search for causes that is productive of what scholastics would call scientia, or what Aristotle would call episteme, true, rigorous, gold standard knowledge. But the phenomenological method explicitly prohibits that sort of search for causes. Ergo, Thomism and phenomenology are methodologically incommensurable, and as a consequence, it is impossible for Thomists and phenomenologists to dialogue as such. With respect to authorities, the argument is fairly straightforward. It's a sociological matter of fact that the questions Thomists raise, the debates Thomists have, and the answers that Thomists give are in no significant way framed or influenced by the authoritative figures and texts in the phenomenological tradition. In fact, one could go further and observe, again as a matter of sociological fact, such figures and texts are ipso facto held at arm's length and viewed with skepticism by the Thomist. Moreover, the reverse is also true. Most phenomenologists, when handed the Summa Theologiae and told that they would benefit from reading it, will gaze into the face of the other with eyebrows raised and an incredulous stare. They open the Summa and they just don't get what's going on. Finally, I can report coming across at least one form of incommensurability argument from the perspective of topic or telos. It goes like this. The thing that distinguishes the sorts of structures of consciousness and experience that phenomenology is interested in, as opposed to, say, empirical psychology or analytic philosophy of mind or something else, is the fact that these structures of consciousness and experience are only accessible through eidetic intuition and phenomenological reduction. These are the sorts of structures that apply equally to absences as to presences, to first-order thoughts and perceptions, and higher-order thoughts and perceptions, to veridical or true experiences and non-veridical or illusory experiences. But from a Thomistic perspective, that makes it sound like phenomenology wants to be a sort of super-transcendental science, the subject of which includes what we would call both beings of reason and real being. And we Thomists are committed to the idea that there simply is no such unified topic to be studied. There is no super transcendental sense of being that bridges, all of our different concepts like species, genus, concept, etc., and real things out there in the world like cats and dogs and medium-sized dry goods. And since we think that there's no such topic to be studied, dialogue between Thomists and phenomenologists is going to be no more possible than it would be between a contemporary physicist and someone who claims to specialize in the study of phlogiston or ether, right? The contemporary physicist is just going to say there's no such thing as ether. There's no such thing as phlogiston. And if you think that's your study, then you're a charlatan. As with the no such thing argument, I think these various incommensurability arguments, all of which I really have come across in the wild, can be gathered together and domesticated into a form of incommensurability master argument that goes like this. Phenomenology has either material or formal or efficient or final causal unity. But if phenomenology has either material or formal or efficient or final causal unity, then it's incommensurable with Thomism. Ergo, phenomenology is incommensurable with Thomism. But if phenomenology is incommensurable with Thomism, then dialogue with phenomenologists as such is impossible. Ergo, dialogue with phenomenologists as such is impossible. And Thomists shouldn't try to do the impossible, so Thomists shouldn't try to dialogue with phenomenologists as such. QED. To push things even further, I think the no such thing master argument and the incommensurability master argument can be combined in a kind of like megazord into a sort of all-encompassing impossibility master argument. And if there are any fans of Patrick O'Brien's nautical fiction about the Royal Navy, I have labeled this the master and commander argument. It goes like this. Either phenomenology is a unified philosophical reality or it's not. If phenomenology is not a unified philosophical reality, then there's no such thing as phenomenology. And if there's no such thing as phenomenology, then Thomists shouldn't try to dialogue with phenomenologists as such. If, however, phenomenology is a unified philosophical reality, then it's incommensurable with Thomism. But if phenomenology is incommensurable with Thomism, then Thomists shouldn't try to dialogue with phenomenologists as such. Therefore, phenomenologists shouldn't try to dialogue with Thomists shouldn't try to dialogue with phenomenologists as such. So this is, the form of this argument is actually just very simple. It's either A or B. If A, then C. If B, then C. Therefore, C. At this point, now, I want to turn our attention away from the entire class of impossibility arguments and introduce in its place what I take to be a more moderate or modest set of arguments, namely impracticality arguments. So impracticality arguments do not claim that dialogue between Thomists and phenomenologists is impossible. They simply claim that it's not a good idea. In other words, even though Thomists can dialogue with phenomenologists, we nevertheless shouldn't. Impracticality arguments have the following general form. Thomists shouldn't engage in an impractical waste of time, but dialogue with phenomenologists as such is an impractical waste of time. Therefore, Thomists shouldn't dialogue with phenomenologists as such. As with the general form of the impossibility argument, I doubt anyone on either side will object to premise 1. But why think that dialogue with phenomenology as such is an impractical waste of time? Why think premise 2 is true? Here again, I'll limit my reasons to those that I've actually come across from Thomists. The first, and by far the most common of these, is what I call the minimal payoff argument. So it goes like this. Doing something with minimal payoff is an impractical waste of time. Dialogue with phenomenologists as such has minimal payoff. Therefore, dialogue with phenomenologists as such is an impractical waste of time. This argument usually takes the form of a series of rhetorical questions. What real benefit will I get from studying phenomenology? What truths will I learn from phenomenologists that I couldn't learn from St. Thomas and the Thomistic tradition? Are there essences that they will teach me to grasp that I couldn't have grasped otherwise? Definitions I'll understand that I couldn't have understood otherwise? Properties that I'll discover that I couldn't have discovered otherwise? And the implicit answer to all of those questions is none, none, and none, respectively. But if that's correct, and if that's even close to being correct, then there are good grounds for affirming the second premise of the minimal payoff argument. From the perspective of these Thomists, the burden of proof is on the phenomenologists to explain what, if anything, they bring to the table of dialogue that the Thomist might be interested in exchanging ideas for. This strikes me as a kind of quasi-material argument, since it mainly concerns phenomenology's doctrine or content, right? What are the truths you have to offer? It's worth pointing out that this minimal payoff argument very plausibly cuts both ways. For triumphalistic phenomenologists are just as likely to think that they have nothing to learn from the Thomists as triumphalistic Thomists are to think that they have nothing to learn from phenomenologists. From their perspective, then, the burden of proof will be on the Thomist to show that they have something of value to bring to the table of dialogue. In addition to the minimal payoff argument, there's a second impracticality argument that similarly cuts both ways. I call it the new language argument, and it goes like this. Learning an entirely new philosophical language is an impractical waste of time. But dialogue with phenomenologists as such requires learning an entirely new philosophical language. Therefore, dialogue with phenomenologists as such is an impractical waste of time. Though similar to the minimal payoff argument, the new language argument stands entirely on its own. Even if there were substantive truths that only a phenomenologist could teach, those truths still might not be worth the price of admission. And the reason, so this new argument goes, is the enormous amount of time and energy required to attain fluency in phenomenology. For that is precisely what phenomenology is to the Thomist, and what Thomism is to the phenomenologist, a foreign language. Each has its own vocabulary, its own grammar, its own idioms and turns of phrase. In Thomism, it is meaningful to ask, brace yourselves, whether a subalternated science differs from a subalternating science on account of its ratio formalis sub qua. In phenomenology, brace yourselves, it is meaningful to ask whether the noematic correlate of transcendental consciousness emerges only through epoche or not. In each tradition, those questions make sense. To one another, they do not. The new language argument, then, is a quasi-formal argument, since it concerns how phenomenology is practiced, not what phenomenology preaches. The obvious objection to this argument is that sometimes learning a new language is not a waste of time. Suppose, just hypothetically, that you move from the United States to Rome to teach at a pontifical university, but you didn't learn the language before arriving. You might, just hypothetically, find yourself at a deep disadvantage and resolve to become more fluent. Could the same not be true in the world of philosophy? It could. But the impracticality argument assumes that it most certainly will not. When phenomenologists and Thomists dialogue, we are more like sightseeing travelers than job-seeking immigrants. The amount of time that a phenomenologist is likely to spend in the world of Thomism and the amount of time that a Thomist is likely to spend in the land of phenomenology is small. Too small, so the argument goes, to make acquiring fluency worthwhile. But, just for the sake of argument, let's assume both, one, that we have a phenomenologist who is fluent in Thomism and a Thomist who is fluent in phenomenology, and two, that there is something to be learned, one from the other. Now can we guarantee that dialogue will be worthwhile? Not according to the third impracticality argument. I call it the different thought worlds argument. It goes like this. Dialogue between people from different thought worlds is an impractical waste of time, but Thomists and phenomenologists as such are from different thought worlds. Therefore, dialogue with phenomenologists or between Thomists and phenomenologists as such is an impractical waste of time. where we thought of the minimal payoff argument along the lines of material causality and the new language argument along the lines of formal causality, we can think of the different thought world argument along the lines of efficient causality. For it has to do with the earlier discussion of authorities. The idea is that even if Thomists and phenomenologists understand one another perfectly and have truths to teach one another, they won't care about those truths. For a truth is exciting and interesting and liberating only insofar as it answers a question or solves a puzzle, right? So all philosophy begins in wonder, right? Aporia or thaumazein, right? And that is not like an aesthetic experience of like, oh, my breath is taken away from me from the beauty of this landscape. That's not wonder. Wonder is bewilderment. Wonder is being puzzled. It's being baffled. It's seeing a phenomenon that you know needs explanation and not having one. That's where philosophy begins, right? So for a truth to be exciting and interesting, it has to answer a question or solve a puzzle. But Thomists don't ask phenomenological questions, and so aren't animated by phenomenological answers. We're not excited about discovering paths back to the things themselves because we don't think we ever left the things themselves. Likewise, phenomenologists don't ask Thomistic questions and aren't animated by Thomistic answers. They're not excited about the idea that prime matter might bear a transcendental relation to quantity because they were never vexed by the ontology of individuation in the first place. In other words, the questions, concerns, and conversations that have come to shape these two traditions through the influence of their authoritative texts and figures constitute completely different thought worlds. The final impracticality argument I've come across is the time better spent argument. I see it as a sort of final causal argument. It goes like this. Whatever keeps us from something better is an impractical waste of time, but dialogue with phenomenologists as such keeps us from something better. Therefore, dialogue with phenomenologists as such is an impractical waste of time. In essence, the Thomistic proponent of the time better spent argument says something like this. Look, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with dialogue or with phenomenology. I'm just saying there are only so many hours in a day. And if I have to pick between spending one of those hours reading the Summa Contra Gentiles by Aquinas or spending one of those hours dialoguing with a phenomenologist, I'm going to pick Aquinas every day of the week. I just get more out of it. Okay. That's a lot of arguments. Now, critical reflection. What should we think of all these arguments? How good actually are they? Perhaps unsurprisingly, I think some of these arguments are better than others. When it comes to impossibility arguments, I worry that the first premise in both master arguments equivocates on the word phenomenology. Phenomenology as a field of study is not the same thing as phenomenology as a philosophical tradition. And it's the field of study, not the tradition, that is plausibly unified topically or teleologically. Focusing on the field of study, then, I'm actually inclined to grant the version of the no such thing argument that says that phenomenology can be reduced to a material part of one or more genuinely joint-carving branches of philosophy. If phenomenology amounts to nothing more than the study of structures of consciousness or experience, and all experience is either sensorial or intellectual, then, at least from my perspective as a Thomist, phenomenology will not constitute a really distinct science over and above the scientia de anima and the scientia de intellectu. If you're doing a Thomistic study of the soul, and you're doing a Thomistic study of the intellect, and you've done it adequately or completely, you will have exhaustively studied the structures of consciousness and experience. But considering phenomenology as a philosophical tradition, I think the answer is different. Here, I don't think its unity is grounded in either a unity of doctrine or a unity of method, and that for the simple reason that I don't think that philosophical traditions in general are constituted by doctrinal or methodological unity, at least not normally. You can find some that are. But I do think that philosophical traditions are normally individuated or distinguished by their authorities. As such, I'm happy to grant that if phenomenology, understood as a tradition, lacked a unity of authority, then there would be no such thing as phenomenology. But I also think that's false. Franz Brentano can and should be included alongside Edmund Husserl as one of the authoritative figures of Western philosophy, Western phenomenology. And the philosophical tradition of Western phenomenology can and should be distinguished from that of Eastern phenomenology, like Buddhist phenomenology, precisely because, despite their topical overlap, they have completely different authoritative texts and figures. The crucial question, then, is whether or not the authorities of the Thomistic and phenomenological traditions differ so much as to render them incommensurable. And I think the answer is no. For one of the virtues of an authoritative account of the individuation or distinction of philosophical movements is that it's graded rather than binary. To the extent that our thought is framed and shaped more or less by figure A than figure B, we can belong more or less to A's tradition than to B's tradition. I am a card-carrying, unapologetic, like hardcore paleo-Thomist, right? And that is true not first and foremost because of the doctrines that I profess or the methods that I employ. I do have doctrines I profess that are Thomistic and methods that I employ that are scholastic, right? But first and foremost, this is because my thought world is predominantly framed in terms set by Aquinas and his followers. Nevertheless, to the extent that my thinking about, say, the foundations of mathematics is framed by Edmund Husserl, and more by Husserl than by Frege, then to that extent, I belong to the phenomenological tradition, and more to the phenomenological tradition than to the analytic tradition. Mutatis mutandis, the same thing will hold for any other issue. So, when it comes to the impossibility argument, I think that if phenomenology is understood as a field of study, the impossibility argument works, because the no such thing argument works. But if phenomenology is understood as a philosophical tradition, then the argument fails. For there's no good reason to think that someone can't be more or less influenced in their thinking by the authorities of different philosophical traditions. Still, that is only to admit the possibility of dialogue between Thomism and phenomenology understood as traditions. It doesn't yet guarantee the fruitfulness of dialogue. And that brings us to the impracticality arguments. My problem with the minimal payoff argument is its minor premise, so premise 2. The only way for a Thomist to know that there's minimal payoff for dialoguing with phenomenologists is if we actually try dialoguing with phenomenologists. Thus, I would be inclined to accept that minimal payoff argument if it comes from the lips of a veteran Thomist who has engaged in good faith attempts to dialogue and has come away disappointed. I am not inclined to accept the minimal payoff argument, indeed, I am inclined not to accept the minimal payoff argument, if it comes from the lips of a triumphalist undergraduate who proudly proclaims himself a Thomist and has only read Ed Feser. With respect to the new language argument, it's the major premise rather than the minor premise that I find objectionable. We don't need to achieve fluency to learn how someone in a different tradition would articulate a problem or express an answer. Moreover, learning enough of another philosophical language to translate back and forth isn't just a valuable tool for dialogue, it's something that actually enriches how we understand our own traditions. It requires us to go back to the basics, so to speak, to approach the fundamentals of Thomism from a new perspective. And that's richly rewarding, right? It's remarkable how only when you learn a second language or start to learn a second language or work on another language do you start to appreciate new aspects of your native language. It's for a similar reason that I find the major premise, so premise 1, of the different thought world argument problematic. As we've seen, authority-constituted philosophical traditions are graded realities, admitting of more or less, both with respect to how deeply one belongs to a given tradition and with respect to how many traditions one can belong to at one and the same time. As such, there might be reason to think that the more purely Thomistic a Thomist is, and the more purely phenomenological a phenomenologist is, the more difficult dialogue between the two will be, since they will need to work extremely hard to get themselves into the headspace of the other, so to speak, understanding what their concerns are and where those concerns are coming from. Nevertheless, that can be done. And doing it is an excellent way to inculcate the intellectual empathy that's characteristic of a mature philosopher. When it comes to the time better spent argument, I think we should deny the major, so deny premise 1, and distinguish the minor, distinguish premise 2. The major premise assumes that we are somehow bound to always make the best possible use of our time. And I think that's false, largely for the same reasons that I think Peter Singer-like utilitarianism is false. As long as we aren't using our time wrongly or badly, we are free to do with it what we will. Human beings are not utility machines intended to optimize efficiency. Just as in morals, there are supererogatory actions, so actions that are neither prohibited nor obliged, so too in philosophy. Doing wrong is not the same as not doing the best. As such, it's simply false to say that whatever keeps us from something better is an impractical waste of time. The correct thing to say would be that doing something without positive value is an impractical waste of time. Now, with regard to the minor premise of the time better spent argument, I'm happy to grant that it might be true sometimes, but it's hard for me to take seriously the idea that it could be true all the time. Dialogue is part of a healthy intellectual life. And who we dialogue with is often determined less by us and more by our circumstances. If I one day find myself in need of dialogue and surrounded exclusively by phenomenologists, then entering into dialogue with those phenomenologists would not keep me from doing something better. It would be availing myself of something good. All right. Having subjected various arguments against Thomistic phenomenological dialogue to a bit of critical scrutiny, I'd like to close with a few observations supporting the dialogical pessimism that they represent. First, just as we are not obligated to use our time in the best possible way, so too no one is obligated to engage in dialogue. If there are Thomists who just want to read Aquinas, or phenomenologists who just want to read Husserl, let them. And this isn't something that we should just tolerate, a preference of theirs that we should tolerate in a way that implicitly moralizes against them. They genuinely are not doing anything wrong. There is no categorical imperative, thou shalt dialogue. Second, while I've argued that impracticality arguments fail when taken as universal in scope, and I've identified at least a few goods that accrue from dialogue, I haven't identified any such goods that are uniquely phenomenological. And there's a very simple reason for that. I'm not sure there are any. In other words, while I affirm both the possibility and the possible fruitfulness of dialogue between Thomists and phenomenologists, I'm not confident, at least at this point, that there's anything special about phenomenology that makes dialogue with phenomenologists more desirable for the Thomist than, say, dialogue with Platonists or pragmatists or analytic philosophers. It's possible that phenomenology, and not just phenomenologists, have something to teach the Thomist that the Thomist cannot discover on his or her own. But I have to confess that I'm a bit of a pessimist on that point. Moreover, I have to admit that my pessimism in this regard is, or at least seems to be, experientially grounded. Phenomenology is the philosophical tradition I first learned as an undergraduate. And I continued to read works by Husserl, Heidegger, Stein, von Hildebrand, and Wojtyła throughout my graduate education and beyond. And I think it's fair to say that since becoming a Thomist, I've engaged in more dialogue with phenomenologists than the majority of my Thomistic peers. Nevertheless, I have yet to come across an undeniably valuable philosophical insight or truth that I consider to be more easily learned or discovered from within the phenomenological tradition than from within the Thomistic tradition. Is this just Thomistic triumphalism slipping through the back door? I don't think so. I hope not. For I suspect that everything I've just reported could be repeated and veridically repeated by a phenomenologist. If Jean-Luc Marion or Emmanuel Falk were here, I could imagine them telling me that despite their youthful Thomistic formation, their continued reading of Aquinas, and their best efforts to dialogue with Thomists, they have yet to find an undeniably valuable philosophical insight or truth that they consider to be more easily learned or discovered from within the Thomistic tradition than the phenomenological. Moreover, I worry that the reason for their inability to do so and the reason for my inability to do so might be the same reason. It's possible that the more deeply embedded we are in one philosophical tradition, the more difficult it will be to experience the good-making features of another. Where does all that leave us? At least vis-a-vis the dialogical naivete with which we began. Well, I think it leaves us in a position of concluding that dialogical naivete should be rejected, and for a deeper reason than it's just being naive, right? Just being sort of unreflective. It should be rejected because there really is something problematic about dialogue between Thomists and phenomenologists as such. The problem is not one of principle, but of practicality, of praxis. While I've identified a few practical values in dialogue as such, I've been unable to identify a parallel practical value to dialogue with phenomenologists as such. And I've suggested that mutatis mutandis, my counterpart on the phenomenological side, may well say the same thing about dialogue with Thomists as such. But until such values are found, it seems like the weight of the argumentation surveyed so far should lean us in the direction of dialogical pessimism rather than dialogical optimism. Nevertheless, that conclusion is subject to easy revision. All that would be required for its refutation would be the identification of some truth or insight that is both genuinely valuable and more easily discoverable from within one of the traditions than the other. And if we could find one such truth on each side, that would suffice. It would allow us to say that not just that dialogue between Thomists and phenomenologists is valuable for both sides, but that dialogue between Thomists and phenomenologists as such is valuable for both sides. And if the question and answer session that we're about to have can help reveal and unearth such truths, I would be delighted. So thank you.